Okay, folks, welcome to part two of the part two lecture on the chapter 11, gender stratification. And we are going to now delve into looking at the experience of gender. And I want to focus you on certain parts to this. So starting out, let me write a few things on the board here for you to think about. So, again, we're talking about, in this section, gender stratification and inequality. And I'll refer you back to the video lecture that you watched, the first video that you watched in the chapter on social stratification and inequality, where we started talking about the difference between stratification and inequality, okay? And specifically around inequality, we talked about the experience of inequality in culture, okay? We also, in that chapter, talked about social class and what different dimensions make up social class. Well, I would encourage you to also think about what different dimensions make up gender. Now, we're going to focus on gender stratification now. Some things I want you to think about. How does gender play out in terms of education? How does gender play out in terms of work? How does gender play out in terms of relationships? Okay. How does gender play out in terms of income? And I'm going to put that up here. How does gender play out in terms of leadership? Just some various dimensions of this, because if we think about our human behavior, how we are situated in society at large, these are really fundamental parts of who we are as adults, certainly. How does education affect the type of work that you have? How do your expectations in relationships affect how you are perceived in society at large? Am I as a male, am I just supposed to do this or just supposed to do that? And you think again about, how do expectations, how do norms, and those kinds of things put pressure on us to be a certain way, right? Okay, so think about these things, and we're going to walk through this and look at, we'll show you some data, some research about how gender plays out in terms of these items here, okay? And the first thing I want to show you is some data from education. And this is, I think, something that you all can relate to. We're looking at data in terms of college fields of study. You might find this kind of interesting. So what you're looking at here are health, education, and social work majors, okay? And we're looking at the lines are the percent of female undergraduates by major. And this is from 1970 to the year about 2013, 2014 or so, okay? Now, how you can think about this is these lines represent female majors. And so, for example, if women make up 60% of all majors, then that means men make up 40%. Okay, so you can think about it that way. But you're going to notice in this chapter there is a decided focus on females, okay? Because the chapter is entitled Gender Stratification, okay? Gender Inequality. Well, who has more power, generally speaking, in society, males or females? Males do, okay? Now, you may not like to hear that, but I'm going to show you data that looks at these dimensions. So when we think about how you get power in society, money, respect, being in having some kind of position of authority, that's generally the terminology, that way we think about inequality and stratification. So that's, we're going to look at the data on this, and you can make your interpretations, but whether there's a question, do we have gender inequality? There's really not a question. We do have gender inequality. Now, some people have to wrestle with that, I don't like to hear that. Well, sometimes the truth is not always what you want it to be, okay? So anyway, looking at the data, you've had a chance to kind of look at some of this, but you can see here that women dominate the healthcare professions. They dominate, now this is looking at fields of study, okay? Women dominate the field of health professions, the majors, and so we're talking about nursing, even doctors, but you also think about it in the healthcare profession, what percent of occupations are of doctors? What percent are nurses? And what percent are people that do cleaning services in health professions, okay? And so now we're talking about jobs a little bit. I'm trying not to do that just yet. What you're looking at are what do people study? That's what this data is looking at. What do people study in college, and how is that broken out by males and females? And we're focusing on the professions, we're focusing on the fields of study that are dominated by females, okay? Social work. You know, almost 80% of people that study social work are female. Now, how do these start to match what we talked about in the last lecture about gender roles? So if we were in class, I would draw a lot of this stuff up on the board and kind of start to connect the dots, but how do our expectations of who we are as males and females funnel us into fields of study? How do the societal norms and expectations influence us in terms of how we think of who we are? Okay, and how does that, force us or have a lot of influence on the areas that we go into study in college? Now, there's a relationship there. You can see a majority of people that study education are females, a majority that study psychology. Across majors, women are more likely to be in college than men. Okay, now that's something that to think about. Moving on to the next slide here. Art, communications, and languages, more women than men. So here we're looking at what percent of people in these subject areas are female. English, language, communications, art, performance. Looking at these and looking at these, you start thinking about the jobs that people have as a result of these fields of study. And those jobs, do you think those jobs make more money or less money than other fields of study, other related occupations? Now, what am I getting at here? Well, let's go back and look at this. Work. So is there stratification in terms of work? Is there stratification in terms of education? Right now, we're just looking at education. So there's inequality built into the expectations and the actual fields of study. Okay, so let's go back and look at some more here. Business majors. Okay. So women are less likely to be in the field of study of business than men are. Here's the 50% line right here. And you can see that women fall below that 50% line. Look at this back in 1970. Back in 1970, okay, what percent of women were studying in business? 10%? 15%? So you think about how things have changed regarding the expectations of men and women in society. And we would expect then that education and what people study has followed suit there, and that's kind of what this is illustrating. Okay? So, now, there's something to be said about more women in college education than men. So what does that say about the future relative to occupations, women in the workforce? Okay, so looking at good data can really help you understand things and also help you project about what the future will look like. Look at this. Computer science and engineering. Percent of female undergraduates by major that are studying computer science or are studying engineering. Now, these are a little bit different, or are they, compared to 1970? Now, of course, engineering is different. There was almost no women, no females studying engineering back in 1970. Okay? Computer science has had a major uptick in the mid-1980s, but it's come down quite a bit since then. Okay? Now, what do you think these fields of study, what kind of jobs do these fields of study lead to? And you start thinking about how much money people make according to what they study, right? So, two questions, right? Why aren't more women in these fields of study? And then, going back here just a little bit, why aren't more men in these fields of study? I mean, what's the purpose? Or what's the reasoning here? Okay, moving on. Look at math and science. Now these are, have changed a lot over time. Look at this. Women are more likely to be majoring in biology than men, but not in math and physical sciences. Close to 50-50, but not there yet. Some of you have heard of STEM programs. That's part of the effort of promoting STEM, and as it relates to gender, is to increase access that females have to fields of study that lead to higher paying occupations. Okay? Now then, I'm going to show you, I'm going to jump to this slide right here. The previous slides are not in your textbook, okay? I went and pulled those from another source, and thought you would find those interesting as it relates to thinking about education, what people study, what they don't study. And you could, begin to think about, well, does what I study in college matter in terms of how much money I'm going to make? Yeah, it does. And there's a larger question as well about why are so many men studying one thing and why are so many women studying something different? And that's more of a social norm type of thing. So I just remembered the slide that you're looking at now is actually from chapter 15, okay? And let me tell you the page number if you want to jot it down and refer to it. Hold on just a second and I will find it for you. This is going to be on page 461, right? So, when we think about inequality, we do think about, again, this takes you back to the last chapter, but when we think about inequality, we think about social class, we think about gender, we think about race, and we think about sexual preference, okay? Now, certainly education makes up social class, certainly education makes up gender, certainly education makes up race and ethnicity, and again, we're talking about inequality. That's what we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks. I mentioned that in the last chapter. Okay, so let's look at this, right? So we have education in men and women, okay? A couple of things I'm going to point out about this. We have, let's look down here, we have figures are for persons aged 25 years and over working full-time. There's that 25 years and over indicator that we talked about in the last chapter. We're not going to worry so much about what you see in parentheses. Don't worry about that. It's a little bit confusing. We're just going to focus on looking at average income by education based upon gender. And that's what this is. Now, a couple things I want to point out. Regardless of what category you look at, whether it's 0 to 8 years of school, 9 to 11, on up the ladder, regardless what you look at, Men make more money on average than women in every category. You look at that. Every category. Okay? Sometimes you've heard that women make 70 cents for every dollar that a man makes. This is the data that's often that it's referring to when you hear that. Okay? Now then, so we're going to look at educational attainment, those that are more likely to complete high school and college in just a moment. Now, we did look at what fields of study that people, males and females, have a tendency to go into. We just looked at that. So, look at this. In some cases, a woman has to go 2 levels up in terms of educational attainment to make more money on average than what a man makes. So, that's an interesting dynamic, okay? One thing we don't know that I usually like to talk about in class with this data, with this chart, what we don't know is what are people studying. This is looking at years of educational experience. Yeah, that's listed in there, and that's what these also indicate here. Bachelor's degree, master's, doctorate, professional degree. But what's not listed particularly here is what are they studying? And is that why average income is lower for women than it is for men? And yeah, that's got part to do with this, because nursing makes less than being a doctor, and women are more likely to go in nursing. We know that, as an example. In terms of education, how many of you, have you ever had a kindergarten teacher that was male? What about your first grade, second grade, third grade, elementary school teachers? Okay. Versus your professors in college. There's some interesting dynamics about inequality and stratification. But part of this issue is what they are studying. But there's also a more deeper, systematic, long-term issue associated with inequality here, whereas women don't make as much money as a man makes for the same job. What this is not looking at jobs. What jobs do people go into? Now, we looked at areas of study in college, but what jobs do people go into? Well, let me show you something related to that. Okay? Let's look at this chart right here. Jobs with the highest concentrations of women. Now, this is in the current chapter that we're covering, chapter 11. And let me tell you what page number this is on. This is towards the end of the chapter. More like the middle of the chapter, I guess, but it is on page 317 if you'd like to refer to this. Now, again, these data help us to understand norms. They help us to understand patterns, okay? You're looking at job, the number of women employed, but this number is what we want to focus on, percent in the occupation who are women. So this is data from the U.S. Department of Labor. It's behind this menu. Once I move the cursor, you'll see it. But the U.S. Department of Labor and the federal government tracks this data, okay? And we know that almost every person that is a speech-language pathologist is a female. We know that almost every preschool or kindergarten teacher is female. Now, you also can look at these jobs and start thinking about, are there patterns in the kinds of jobs these are? And I'll ask you to look at that. Notice these are a lot of assistant positions: administrative assistant, medical assistant, dental assistant, medical transcriptionist, dental hygienist. Those are assistant positions. Who do they assist? Largely, they're assisting a male. Okay? How do these occupations reflect gender roles about women being nurturers, caregivers, more empathetic, more emotional, you could make the connection with that as well. Okay?